Semester. But our speaker today is Carina Wyborn, and Carina is here she's a doctoral student from the Australian National University in Canberra. Did I say that? Right. Her doctoral research examines cross-scale collaborative governance dimensions of large landscape conservation initiatives, and especially relevant for people here, she's comparing the initiatives in Australia to those here in the United States, including such initiatives that we're familiar with, like the Wyborn, the Yellowstone Yukon, and also the Crown of the Continent. She teaches in the Human Ecology program at the Fenner School of Environment and Society. Please join me in welcoming Carina Wyborn.
Hello, everybody. Great. So thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks very much to Sarah and Matt for inviting me to come and speak. So as Sarah said, my PhD is comparing a case study in Australia and then the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. And basically, I'm trying to look at how these ideas of large landscape collaboration, which have arisen from science, are being put into practice, and trying to understand the translation of scientific ideas into a collaborative conservation setting over large landscapes. So what I'm going to talk today about is how, in the Australian context, this notion of ecological connectivity has been taken up and shaped and reshaped to fit the Australian context. So here in North America, there's a lot of focus on large landscape conservation for migratory pathways, for ungulates, or for grizzly bear connectivity, large home ranges, those sorts of things. The Australian environment is completely different. We don't have large carnivores with large home ranges, so the social and scientific justification for something like large landscape connectivity needs to be very different. So the story I'd like to walk you through today is how that has happened. And it's happened rather rapidly. So when I started my dissertation 3 years ago, there was not a lot going on in this space, a couple of projects here and there. But then as we speak, the federal government is currently writing a National Wildlife Corridor plan. So they're putting $10 million into the development of that plan, but there's an expectation that a lot more funding will flow after that. It's being very much framed as a climate change adaptation initiative to provide critical linkages between habitats to facilitate species migration under climate change. And this is a quote from our Environment Minister saying, corridors give strategic meaning for protecting, for resilience, and then also for adaptation. So how in the space of 3 years have we come from having nothing to having all of these initiatives over the Australian continent? Now, these are just the very large ones, but there's actually quite a lot more. So in my work, that's just to give you some scale there to show that Australia is actually the same size as the lower 48. So if you can think about that in terms of how big these landscapes actually are. So I've been working a little bit with this project, Gondwana Link in the west, which is the oldest one, this east meets west corridor, Habitat 141, which is where my major work has been focused, and then the Great Eastern Ranges, which is the sort of sliver spine, but that's broken up into 5 little nodes. So a government policy advisor that I interviewed last year said connectivity is the new black. So how did this happen? What's happening in terms of the translation of science into practice? And then I'm going to use the idea of narratives to explore how that has happened, and then possible potential lessons that can be learnt from this. So connectivity conservation is about the protection of natural connections within the landscape. It takes on a whole lot of different forms in terms of corridors or stepping stones or these kind of linear revegetation strips. There's a whole heap of very complex science that underpins all of this, but the basic notion of it is scaling up the area or locale of focus for conservation. So then to operationalise something like that, then we need to have an interconnected system of properties. There's coordination and alignment between different actors managing the landscape. And in Australia, this has been done either through acquisition or through private land conservation is a very big focus of it. And whether or not it's about restoring habitat or actually just protecting the habitat that's there depends very much on the landscape which you're working in, obviously. So my major case study is very much about restoration and planting trees on a very large scale. But the other dimension to connectivity conservation that makes it quite interesting is that it frames itself as this socially inclusive approach to conservation. So it's not just about managing large landscapes, but it's also about how people feel and value these interconnected spaces. And this kind of active involvement of people in conservation as a sort of in opposition to the idea that a protected area is a place where you kick people out. So the projects that I'm looking at back home are very much framed within this metaphor of connecting people and connecting landscapes. And so I'm trying to understand how framing it in that way has shaped the way that it's put into practice. So just really quickly, this is the sort of hypothesised ideal way in which science gets translated into practice. You have a problem, you do some research, you apply that knowledge. It's all very well and good. However, unfortunately, it's not always like that, and this model is premised on the idea that science is separate from society, that practitioners will consult experts and then apply that knowledge to their context, and it very much ignores the social and contextual dimensions, both of the way that knowledge is produced and how that knowledge is applied. So amongst the many critiques of that model is this idea that comes from the sociology of science, that the way in which we understand the world and the way in which science is translated into society is co-produced. So how we think about the world is shaped by what we see, what we do, and also what we think should be done. So this rejects the idea that science is separate from society, and what's particularly important for the story that I'm going to tell is that this accepts and legitimises other knowledge systems within the way in which science is applied and taken up. And it sees knowledge production very much as a process back and forth between science and society. And so what I'm trying to explore today is the way in which the science of connectivity has been co-produced in the Australian context. And to do that, I'm looking at these narratives. So a narrative is a story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. And the way in which a narrative is constructed very much, particularly in a policy context or a science context, shapes the available options. So I love this picture because you can see that the fish, they go on this little journey, there's a kind of bit of excitement in the middle, and then they land in a basket that's very much narrower than what they started within. So the way in which these narratives construct the end point, it sort of can shut out other options from debate. So characteristics of a successful policy narrative: it's the way in which their proponents have access to media and power. If it resonates with deeply held cultural values, it strikes a chord within some sort of national mood, and then the prescription entails no radical redistribution of power or wealth. So what I'm going to go through is show how connectivity has fitted through that. But this idea of policy narratives has been taken and used in the context of science to create this idea of a science narrative, where we create these very simple stories about how particular human environment interactions create a problem, and then have this, again, this ending, this point where you make the normative leap from what is to what should be within a very simple kind of a story. So just quickly, methods have been participant observation and interviews and document analysis. So I've been working on this for the last 2 years, and I've spent a lot of time just hanging out with people who work within this space. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Australian context, I'm really not going to go into much detail, but part of the story that's quite important is land care. Land care is a landholder-driven environmental stewardship program. It started in the late 80s. Very successful people and place-based conservation. So small groups of farmers coming together to restore their landscapes. It was very seminally brought together the National Farmers Federation and the Australian Conservation Foundation to work within this idea of land care. Working towards tangible goals, very much about experiential learning. So lots and lots of money has been put into land care, but unfortunately, successive government reviews have shown that the ecological outcomes of this movement have been highly questioned. However, socially, land care is viewed as an inherently good thing because it's, farmers getting together, getting dirty and restoring the landscape. But we have these enduring problems which are probably very much the same as in the US. We have fragmented ecological, social and institutional systems. And a recent review of conservation and resource management funding in Australia suggested that we need to be overcoming these fragmentations if we're actually going to effectively and successfully manage our landscapes. We have problems of scale, we have different boundaries, different land tenures, jurisdictions, disciplines, very much the same as it is here. Same sorts of threats, land use change, fragmentation, invasive species, inappropriate fire regimes. One difference that's very much the case between here and the US is that we have an incredibly high rural to urban migration. Australia is the most urbanised country in the world. 85% of our population live in major urban centres. So within these fragmented landscapes, there's an enormous amount of volunteer burnout, loss of faith in government funding. The majority of our funding for conservation comes from the federal government. And people in that landscape are pretty jaded by how the government has been handling their work. And so when I was over here last year looking at Y2Y, I was just amazed by the number of different groups and people that there are working within the Northern Rockies landscape trying to do conservation work. It's a completely different story in Australia. So we get to the story. These three lines have come are continually in this connectivity conservation space. This idea that the science says we must be doing this, the notion that connectivity is intuitive and that connectivity is all about working together. So that is the narrative in a piece. For this particular story, the protagonist is the Linking Landscapes collaboration. So Linking Landscapes is a group of people who have come together over the last year or two. Their focus is large landscape conservation, in particular the protection of biodiversity, climate change adaptation, and links between healthy people and healthy landscapes. And they very much mobilise this sort of crisis discourse. We need to act now, we have to work together, and we have to work at large scales because that's the only way that we're going to deal with this biodiversity climate change crisis. And they have been calling for large landscape conservation as a natural defence strategy for Australia. I don't really like the war metaphor, but that's the kind of urgency and crisis in which this kind of language is being used. So this is the beginning of our story. There's this pervasive sense within the Australian community that the countryside is sick, it's getting worse. You don't even need to put climate change in there for this to have been a big problem. And so then you add climate change and it just becomes yet another stressor on a very, very degraded landscape. So climate change is a double whammy affecting species, ecosystems and ecosystem processes. So this image is of it's the rabbit-proof fence. It's in Western Australia. So on one side we see farmland and on the other side that's a reserve. So this is the kind of habitat fragmentation that we're dealing with. Australia, because of land clearing over the last century, has one of the highest rates of mammalian extinction in the world. So that's what connectivity in our context is about focusing on. So the middle of the story, and there's quite a lot in this quote, so I'll break it up, but I think it's an intuitively appealing concept. We've got these highly disturbed, fragmented landscapes, so connect them up. It's because something can be done at the scale of an individual where you can feel like you're actually connecting into something larger and being part of a bigger picture project. So firstly, to deal with this notion that connectivity is intuitive. So we have up in the top corner, we have the picture of the rabbit-proof fence and those sorts of highly fragmented landscapes. In the middle there is what's a typical view of the sort of landscapes of southeastern and southwestern Australia. It's the scattered paddock tree landscape. So these kind of areas which would have once been forested and now have just these standing gums within them, they actually provide quite a lot of movement for bird species. They're actually a very important part of ecological connectivity in the landscape. And then down the bottom here we have the sorts of restoration corridors that Landcare used to plant. So this idea that we'll create these small, narrow wildlife corridors because these landscapes used to be connected, so obviously we have these unhealthy, unconnected landscapes. Back when they were connected, they were healthy. It's intuitive. We'll link them up. But part of that also comes from this sort of social memory that we have of Landcare being an inherently good thing. You know, those guys were doing good work, and now all we need to do is scale it up. We'll do it on a bigger picture scale. We'll just cross the whole continent. So within that, there's this kind of simplistic dualism which has been formed where fragmentation is bad, so obviously the flip side, ecological connectivity, is a good thing. And then moving on to that idea that you're framing the individual within the collective. So it's been very much framed in terms of private land conservation. By protecting your patch within this bigger picture, you can do something about climate change, as opposed to the kind of general climate change rhetoric which says, if you turn your light off, how do you know whether or not your neighbours are turning your light off? Whereas this is actually about together we can all make a bigger difference and we can do something. And these projects have very much framed it in a way that has, instead of having the bigger picture as a threat, which is what I've seen over here, the bigger picture is actually empowering. So the actions of each of us impact on the experience of us all. We're part of something that's bigger than all of us. And then as you get progressively down to people's actual place is something which is special to someone. So this is the continental scale, the regional scale, and then down to the local scale. And I think that somehow this framing has just been very, very effective in Australia, and the momentum around large landscape conservation has had enormous public and social support. However, every good story has a controversy. The science of large landscape conservation in Australia has very large question marks over it. And so while there's this idea that it's a shift towards management of landscapes and processes, people are questioning whether or not these linear corridor strips is actually going to be producing the ecological connectivity outcomes which the projects are trying to achieve, because connectivity is site, species, scale, process dependent. And so by just having this blanket scale up restoration approach to managing connectivity, I'm not sure whether or not, there isn't actually empirical evidence to suggest that these measures are going to have the outcomes people would like. Other people have questioned whether or not it is actually going to be an effective climate change adaptation strategy. The idea that species are all going to pack their bags and go and wander up or down a corridor that we've decided is, according to scientists that I speak to, a very gross oversimplification of some very complex processes. And then again, that question mark about whether or not just because fragmentation is bad, connectivity is good. The idea that these landscapes used to be connected, they're now very different from when they were connected, and we have massive problems with fire and invasive species, and connectivity for fire is as you guys would well know as well as we do, a bad thing. If you have a highly connected landscape, fire is going to spread across it a lot faster, and managing fire is a huge problem in Australia. So, like all good science, there's debate, conjecture and uncertainty. How do we progress? Where do we go from there? Interestingly enough, in amongst all of that uncertainty that's within the science, I have actually found a huge number of different justifications and motivations for ecological connectivity, which go over and above the sort of kind of narrow notion of what ecological connectivity is within a scientific context. So you probably don't really need to pay that much attention to this, to all of the diversity which is in there, but to say that there is these sort of instrumental goals which are much more focused on the actual ecology, but then it's also a framework for implementation and distributing funding across a large landscape. But then there's also these social and symbolic drivers about the stories of connecting people and connecting landscapes, and these big visionary initiatives which are going to overcome this enormous crisis which we face. So there's much more to the ecological connectivity movement in Australia now than just linking up patches of habitat. And this quote here kind of frames the response that the ecological academic community is having for this. From the broader community, what they're doing is from the perspective of humans saying whether or not it's connected, that's where it starts and stops. So the true scientific meaning of connectivity is very different from what the conservation community are doing. So that this photo down here is a picture of the kind of ecological restoration that's being done. So this will be put out with a direct seeder. The in-between gets sprayed completely so that no weeds come up in between, and then you end up with your nice little row of trees. And there's, like I said, very big question marks as to whether or not functionally for species those landscapes are much better than the scattered trees that are currently there. But that debate has been lost because of this science narrative, and I'm very much in the opinion that it's much more complex than just that question around the science, because at the end of our story we have this idea that at the scale of mega corridors, no one tenure, no one agency is going to be able to do the job. So integrating across tenures is critical. So you come to the end of this story where all of a sudden we need to be collaborating and working together across large landscapes. Connectivity has given people a justification to work together at a larger scale, which is what successive reviews of government policy in Australia has suggested we need to be doing for biodiversity conservation. So management for connectivity requires collaboration, because unlike when we were managing sites and species and you focus on a particular land tenure, if you're thinking about connectivity, you do need to think about what's happening in other parts of the landscape and in bits of the land that other land managers are working on, and so you have to collaborate. So now we have these multi-agency, NGO and community partnerships where people are coming together and they're actually talking about a lot more than ecological connectivity. They're just talking about land management and talking about a whole lot of different ways in which you can manage on a larger scale. And so these connectivity projects, which I've been looking at, are developing a potential framework for cross-tenure and cross-scale integration. And that, I would argue, is an inherently good thing. So then, just to pull apart the narrative, the visibility of proponents and their access to media and power has been a huge part of this story. The Linking Landscapes collaboration is being pushed by some of the more well-known proponents within the Australian conservation community. There's only 22 million people in Australia, so if you then carve out of that the academic and practitioner conservation space, there's not a lot of people. So it's a much smaller community than it would be over here, and if you get a few powerful proponents in support of something, things can go a long way think that's what's happened. The federal government was lobbied quite hard prior to the 2010 election, which is where we got the election commitment to have the National Wildlife Corridors plan. That it resonates with widely and deeply held cultural values. So the science lined up with people's common sense. It's really a good place to be if you're advocating something. Advocating something that's counterintuitive is really hard yards. So that's, again, that idea that connectivity is intuitive and people, whether you have a science background or not, can understand that landscapes should be connected. And that it strikes a chord with the national mood. So the stories of fragmentation are very negative, whereas restoration at scale, it's visionary, it's bold, it's positive, it's trying to get together the resources that can actually tackle this problem. And I think this fits in with a broader conservation narrative around trying to stop telling a negative story about biodiversity. I've seen this in a lot of places, people are sick of conservationists waving their fingers and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that. It's actually much more about empowering people to feel positive about the changes that they can make in their lives. And I think that connectivity, as how it's happening in Australia, is very emblematic of that bigger shift within the conservation community more broadly. And then the prescription entails no radical redistribution of wealth and power. So this is a map schematic of Habitat 141, my major case study. And underneath all of those little sticky labels that you can see is pretty much everybody that's working within that landscape. So what they're trying to do is get everybody everybody in the same tent working together. Nobody's left out, everybody's there. And so within that, it's not about trying to take power off different people, trying to redistribute funds within a landscape more effectively so that everybody gets a share of the pie. So it's not trying to undermine existing power networks within there, and it's all voluntary. So there's no one forcing any landholders or any agencies to be part of this. It's all part of you being inspired to be part of some sort of bigger picture thing, which is why there's so much emphasis on that inspiration. But it means that it's not actually challenging existing networks, whether or not that's problematic in their ability to actually achieve their outcomes. If you want to change land management at some stage, you're going to have to change the way things are done. But one of the other reasons that I think that this has been so successful is because it's an incredibly normative movement. The people, there's this idea that by collaborating, we've got this rock solid vision that we're working towards, and this belief, this really, really strong belief that by working together we're going to make a difference. And the conversations around getting all of those different players to work together are incredibly difficult. There's the same sorts of agency turf wars going on in Australia, and then the disconnect between the NGO community and the government community. It's not easy, and I've seen people sit through incredibly difficult discussions. And I think that it's this, what I'm calling normative glue, which has kept people there. Interestingly enough, it's another thing that they get critiqued by. So this really strong, if you don't get it, you're not needed in the project. And this, we definitely understand each other. I just wish more people would understand us. And the response that you get from people outside of that is that people call them connectivity zealots. And this quote from one of Australia's leading ecologists, I've never converted an atheist, I don't ever see myself converting one of those connectivity people. Interestingly enough, that person is now, so that was from January 2010, he's now on the science working group for the government policy advisory process. So what's happened is that the scientists who were quite critical of connectivity, now we've got this big government initiative going on, they are now starting to, then it's not that they're not critiquing connectivity anymore, but it's that underneath that same umbrella, they're trying to advocate for their particular outcomes or their particular approach. So what we're seeing is the way in which science and policy and practice feed into each other to continually kind of shape and co-evolve. And then this idea that it doesn't actually matter in terms of the science of ecological connectivity being problematic, because we need large-scale restoration, and if having connected gives people a vision for large-scale, then that's great. There's no doubt that what they're doing in terms of the integrated cross-scale, cross-tenure stuff is useful, but whether or not the primary usefulness is that they're connected, I'm not convinced. So that's, you know, enabling us to move forwards while there's still so much uncertainty within the science. And that actually the social momentum that's being garnered around this idea is incredibly important, and we need to capitalise on that. So in conclusion, science moves in mysterious ways. It's been central to this story, but not through that kind of rational trickle down and transfer idea that you have a scientific solution to a particular problem and it gets implemented. That there is science backing for the idea of a crisis, and you know, some of the ecologists who are critiquing these projects are the same ecologists that the people who I'm working with will invoke to say we have to do this because of so-and-so's science. So this science base is very important. But connectivity has actually been co-produced in the Australian social and ecological landscape. So we now have a very different understanding of ecological connectivity to one that you would find here in the US. And blurring those boundaries between what's science and what is this kind of social value and impetus to work together has meant that we're now having a national conversation about large landscape conservation, and that is a very productive space. And the broader science narrative approach that I think I've been taking with this paper shows that there's actually a much more dynamic and dialectic interplay between science and practice, rather than thinking about the diffusion of science as overcoming this great chasm between theory and practice. I think we need to stop thinking about those two things as polar opposite, but actually more of a productive conversation. So that now leaves a bunch of time for feedback or questions or anything like that. So thanks for listening. And there's references.
Comment on the role of Indigenous people. You mentioned incorporating knowledge into this from a variety of sources, but is there a land-based or sovereignty issues related to Indigenous people in Australia?
So the land rights stuff in Australia, the way that the native title legislation was written excluded pretty much a lot of the Australian landscape, particularly mining and pastoral leases. So in terms of land tenure issues, a lot of the parts of that, if we go... Oh, this is going to take a while. Hang on, let's do it this way. Where the projects are, or where the projects that I've been looking at, they're not going to be land rights claims anyway, with the exception of up in this kind of area and in the Northern Territory. And so it's a different story up there. I've not been so involved with those projects because it's such a different space. In terms of bringing Indigenous knowledge into this, there's definitely an acknowledgement of the role of Indigenous groups in whatever comes of it all, and projects have had different kind of working with them, but there's no real... There is engagement, but it's difficult, basically. Capacity is a huge issue in terms of Indigenous capacity in Australia. The sort of socio-demographic statistics for Indigenous people are pretty depressing. So there's a few key people that are involved, but it's not a big focus at the moment.
Could you comment on maybe the general attitude attitude in Australia towards putting private land into conservation easements? Maybe like as compared to the United States, what you're saying?
I can't comment on the United States in terms of conservation easements because I've been looking more at how the projects collaborate rather than what they actually do on the ground. It's getting bigger in Australia. There's a lot of different momentum and different government initiatives towards payments for environmental services, and there's a few different NGOs that work towards putting easements on land. I think it's not really gaining that much traction outside of the conservation-minded people, but so land care covered about 35% of Australian farmers. I would say that it's probably similar sorts of statistics in terms of conservation easements, but as more and more government money gets put towards actually paying landholders for those services, I think things will come. There's issues, I don't know whether or not your easements are in perpetuity, but people are not, the in perpetuity ones were not so popular, and so now they're moving towards sort of 15-year contracts that then get renegotiated, and that seems to be more popular, or seem to be having more luck.
How do you measure desire for wildlife corridors with the problems with feral and introduced mammals?
Sorry, can you...
Some of the ideas is to provide connectivity for wildlife.
Yes.
But you've got problems with introduced and feral species, like the rabbit finch.
Yep.
How do you balance the two?
And that's one of the major critiques of the initiatives, and the line which is given by the connectivity people is that it's about active management. Foxes and cats are prolific. They're all over the Australian landscape, whether the landscape is connected or not. So you need to manage them regardless. And that's part of the bigger kind of people side of it as well, because it's been framed as job opportunities, because someone has to manage these landscapes, someone has to deal with those issues, so there's some job opportunities there. The other side of it as well is that you need to manage invasive species across land tenures, and so by having these kind of groups of people and frameworks for collaboration already, that enables you to have a cross-tenure fox baiting program. I know that in Gondwana Link, this project down here, they've got a number of larger scale, large landscape fox baiting programs that has been brought about because of the initiative. But then the other side of it, if you look at those pictures of the revegetation corridors, if I can get to one, that one just there, you know, lots of people have said to me that's a perfect highway for a fox to run down and chase whatever. So it's part of the debate.
Could your national the legislation passed in 2010, did it give guidelines? It sounds like it didn't give mandates for this. Did it give helpful guidelines for engaging in this kind of collaboration?
It hasn't been passed yet. The draft plan is being developed at the moment. The draft should come out at the end of this month for comment, to be in by December. I have been part of the process, and then I came over here at the start of August. So I'm expecting a copy of the draft to arrive in my inbox sometime soon. It's not going to be overly prescriptive in terms of guidelines for management, because they recognise the enormous diversity in what's going on. And there's a desire from the federal government not to undermine all of the existing work that's been done by the initiatives, because the federal government is definitely playing catch up here. These projects have been going on The oldest one started in 2002, but there's a lot of momentum going, and so they want to kind of facilitate that to keep going rather than undermine it with requirements and legislation and that kind of stuff.
Get back more to your topic and look at the slide and fix what I'm about to ask. So is science driving the narrative, or is science being interpreted by people into the narrative, or is the narrative independent of science? Where's the narrative coming from in Australia?
The narrative is coming from the way that the ideas of habitat, the science of habitat fragmentation has been taken and brought into a narrative. I wouldn't say that one is leading the other. I would say they're feeding off of each other. And I think that what's happened is that some bits of information about habitat fragmentation, the impact of habitat fragmentation on biodiversity, have gotten out, they've left science, and then people have taken them up and interpreted them within their own context and has created this story. And now that the National Wildlife Corridor Plan is there's a whole lot of science which is going to go off and get done now about looking at large landscape connectivity in the Australian environment. And I think that ecosystems are so intensely complex that if you do a bunch of research into a particular thing, you're going to find it's important. And then so the science follows the practice and the practice follows the science. It's all intertwined, which is why I put that model of co-production up, because I just don't think you can separate it out.
It sounds like there's a certain amount of the science side saying to the conservation side, that's not what we meant.
Yes, definitely.
And the conservation side looking at the science results and saying, that's not what we were intending to get to.
Absolutely. One of the project coordinators who I have spent quite a lot of time with over the last couple of years, one night said to me, you know, if the scientists think that by critiquing people who are out there trying to do something, they're part of the solution, they're wrong, they're part of the problem. So there's very much, since the critiques are starting to come out, the projects now talk about threat abatement a lot more than they did 2 years ago. So there's some learning going on there. But as scientists are getting critical of things, the guy who made the comment about the atheist, another comment that he said to me was, we just need to get some balance into the debate without being shot. So, you know, the practitioners are a little bit like, what? We thought we were doing what you said we needed to do. You've been telling us that habitat fragmentation is bad. Now we're trying to deal with it and it's the wrong thing to do. What do you want us to do? So.
It's kind of a broad question, but I wonder if there's any concern in all this about one particular voice in the debate, in the policy debate. I guess the thing that comes to my mind is probably mining in Australia. That's sort of an entity unto itself, where they're so strong economically that they're influencing the political debate. Do you find anything like that?
In this, the role of mining in this, or just more?
In the attempt to connect, be they private or public lands, do you find that there's some sort of outside force exerting influence on the debate?
There isn't, in the biodiversity space, there's conflict that's going to come. There's big conflict at the moment in Australia over agricultural land versus mining land, and a lot of that high-value agricultural land is also high-value biodiversity conservation or threatened ecosystems. And mining land tenure excludes everything in Australia, mining and roads. So, you know, if they found some gold underneath Parliament House, then, you know, they could go for it. So coal seam, gas, exploration and coal in Queensland and Western Australia, it's just same sort of story as it is here. And that is not shaping the debate at all, but it has the power to come in and just undermine everything. So in Gondwana Link, one of the NGOs that's working in that project in WA, they had a piece of land that they bought with some help from federal government funding, and then there was mining exploration on it, or on a property next door, and they wanted to build a road straight through the middle of this piece of land that was for conservation, so that for 7 years while they're building the pipeline, they can have this road, and then after 7 years the road's not going to get used. So that land is going to get sliced in half, and there's nothing that G-Link can do or the NGO can do to stop that from happening. So it's just the reality of land management in Australia. It doesn't shape the conversation, it just squashes it. Is it different here? I'm interested in, because I feel like this story about the rise of collaboration is very much shaped by the Australian context. How are these sorts of issues shaped by the US social, ecological landscape?
I think it's very similar. I think of friends who are scientists who did good scientific work and then were condemned by the conservation community because of the results they disagreed with. And then I think about people who are doing science for and with the conservation community. And they're being condemned because of self-interest and, of course, they're debated by the industry.
Maybe one of the differences is that many of our collaborations have come out of very hard and fast rules that have resulted in litigation and gridlock about what is going to happen, because we have some pretty strict rules that get litigated. And many of these collaborative approaches have emerged from people trying to get past that toward a mutually beneficial outcome. It's not driven so much by that just perception of the crisis, but actually by a legal crisis as well. It doesn't sound like you have that going.
No, we don't. Our equivalent of the ESA is pretty weak. And also we're not a litigious society, more generally. Well then, thanks very much for coming and listening.